Great.
And you can use this to change this.
That's super.
Okay. And so we want to put this slide back on onto the side.
Yeah.
I think you should.
Where do you want? I'm going to introduce backgammon and what?
Volleyball.
You're probably going live right now, so.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Good evening. I'm Renata Caesar, the Working Group Chair of the Yale International Alliance, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight at the Médecins Sans Frontières headquarters in London. And it's on behalf of the two partners hosting this event. This is the first of the 2014 Yale Club of London Speaker Series, which has become something really dynamic thanks to the energies of Anna Canicio, who's over here, and her colleagues, and Farouk. And if you have any ideas for speakers for the series or any other thoughts about the Yale Club of London, please speak to them, have a word with them. I'm also supposed to mention a date to you, which is the 10th of May, which is this year's Yale Day of Service. Last year, we had 3,500 alumni in, I think, 280 sites around the world participating. And this year, it's May 10th, the Yale Club of London is organizing the local events, and the information is going to be on the website soon, so be sure to have a look at it. Your other host tonight is the Yale International Alliance, which is a shared interest group for international alumni to connect with each other, both around the world and with students and faculty in New Haven. And as part of the launch of our website, we're having the series of interactive web lectures like this one. And if you would like to participate, if you would like to do a presentation to the worldwide Yale alumni audience about your work or about your passion, please get in touch with us. Or if you have a friend, another alumni you know who you think might be fascinating for us to listen to, please get in touch. Our chairman of the communications committee is here, Aunt Johnny. So you can speak to him or to me tonight, or get in touch with us on our website, email, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And now I'd like to turn to our alumni speaker, Marc DuBois, who's the executive director of the MSF in the UK. We're very excited to have him speaking to us tonight. And I hope he will share with us something of his journey from being a philosophy major in Silliman, and he tells me also majoring in backgammon and volleyball and intramural sports, to working in some of the most striking and inaccessible places on earth, to his work and the issues he's concerned with today. So could you please join me in giving Marc a very warm welcome.
Thank you. First, thank you all for coming out. There was the threat of the tube strike. It's pouring. The trains are down, and it's really good to see you. And then, really exciting that we're beaming this around the world. No doubt, there's some people back from the old days in Silliman, 1981. People who are looking and going, "That guy's a director." I'm withdrawing my donation to MSF. Look, it is a bit of a journey. I don't want to. It's hard to talk about it without taking way too much time. But what it is, fairly simple. I left Yale and went into the Peace Corps, and it's ever since then. I was stationed in rural Burkina Faso. I was raising chickens, which has nothing to do with a philosophy degree, and it was just that experience of about 2 years, a little over 2 years out in a rural African setting, that it just put a bug inside of you. And even later in life, I was working as a public interest attorney in New Orleans, and the bug's still there. And There's just something a bit missing. And so I, at a certain point decided to go back into that international arena, and one thing led to another, and I was a project coordinator in Khartoum. And since then, I've been in MSF now 15 years. It's 12, I finished my MSF career, or this job. I may come back some other day to MSF, but in the end of this month. So it's been quite a journey, about 15 years for me. I was stationed in the field and then the Amsterdam headquarters for 6 years. And there, the particular side of MSF's work that I deal with is sort of a little bit the ideology and the principles of the organization. That goes back to that philosophy degree maybe, but also I got a law degree at a certain point, and really working and using humanitarian law, human rights law, the Geneva Conventions, things like that to frame what it is we're doing in certain places. Because we are a medical humanitarian organization. Of course, there are medical crises that we are dealing with, but underneath the medical crises, there's almost always another kind of crisis, and it's a political crisis. It's a crisis of violence. It's a crisis of neglect, abuse, and things like that. And so, I'm basically very happy to share a little bit of that with you guys today. And what I want to do, because I have a tendency to talk on, is try and race through a lot of photos, a lot of this and that, and then allow some time for us to come back and see what you're interested in asking questions about. So let's see how this works. That's the basic program. I need to remember one thing. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, as we're known in the States, same organization. Talk a little bit about that, and what do we mean by humanitarian action? And then I was recently in DRC, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. Maybe use that as a case example for a little bit. And then I really, there's 3 slides with a bunch of bullet points on it. Just the world is changing. Humanitarian action has never been easy, but the world is changing, and I think it's becoming more difficult. And that's really where I spend a lot of my time, is talking with people in the organization about how are we going to overcome what are some very significant challenges in the world. So the organizational overview, and I'm not going to bore you with this, so I want to make it quick. There are some dispatch magazines right here on the corner of the table if you want to take something home. But basically, look, we're a humanitarian organization. That means providing medical assistance, which is our choice. And of course, we don't do it to Christian populations or just to children. It really is based on need, and it's all over the world. We are in over 60 countries. What do we want to do? This is the objectives of the organization: preserve life, alleviate suffering, protect human dignity, and we do that through medical aid and témoignage, which is maybe translated as bearing witness, or perhaps advocacy, other things, but I'll touch on it in a little bit. So just a brief history. 1971, we're a little over 40 years old. This section, that was in France, and soon after that there were MSF organizations that grew in place, basically what are still the big operational centers, aside from Paris, which is Brussels, Amsterdam, Geneva, and Barcelona. And then in the 90s, really going out and in Scandinavia, the US, Japan, Hong Kong, the UK, Germany, Italy, places like that, building sections, and that's when the UK was set up. We won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. Sorry, it was my first year in the organization, so I take some credit for it. And then, look, we are 5 operational centers. We're 19 sections, 11 offices, 34,000 staff worldwide, and we spent about $1 billion last year. We are a fairly heavy hitter in the world of humanitarian action. We are by far and away the largest medical humanitarian organization, by far. And what's interesting, though, because we think of ourselves as enormous, $1 billion is about what you'd spend at a fairly large, university hospital somewhere in New York, somewhere in London. I mean, I'm going to show you some of the numbers we do with that money. I said we're in over 60 countries actually, but over 50% of the resources in these. And these year in, year out, right now Syria, this is 2012. Right now, Syria would be on that list for 2013, 2014, but it doesn't. A lot of these, Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, DRC, Haiti have been on this list for a number of years, and over 50% of our resources are spent right in those 10. So what is it that we do? Well, you know, we work in these kinds of areas, and I think the point is we work in crisis situations because it's in crisis situations that basically that we're needed the most. There's a whole world of need out there, but what we want to focus on is crisis, and the reason we do that, if you recall, the objective of the organization is to preserve life, save life, and alleviate suffering. Where do you do that? Where do you find the need for that in the greatest concentration? Well, it's in crisis situations. So 8.3 outpatient consultations, 1.6 million of them, 8.3 million, 1.6 million of them malaria. Almost 500,000 hospitalizations. Surgery, I think the numbers speak for themselves. These is HIV patients, and over 250,000 on antiretroviral therapy, and that's an enormous weight in certain countries. For instance, in a place like Myanmar, formerly Burma, about 85–90% of the people receiving antiretrovirals are getting them through MSF, because there's very little other organizational or government infrastructure to be able to do that. 185,000 deliveries. Vaccinations, also a big part. We are a medical organization, but it's not just what doctors do. Obviously, the idea of health is a little bit bigger than just sort of pills and treatment. It has to involve nutrition, it has to involve water and sanitation, and it has to involve mental health. So a little bit, sort of broader idea. Bearing witness is what I talked about before, and it really is just that. Look, I was in Angola in 2000. We were feeding enormous numbers of internally displaced people in a country where anyone, who here doesn't have a green thumb? You could grow something in Angola. Just plant it in the ground, it will grow. The rivers are full of fish, the forests are full, and yet, malnutrition crisis. What's going on there? You can't simply feed people and give them food, because that's not really their problem. That is their immediate medical problem, but that is not the cause of their crisis, and you have to get at that. And what we look at is really the proximate cause. We are also not an organization that will say, well, globalization has changed. We're not attacking at that meta level, and I think there's some really good work being done by other organizations doing it. But we are asking the patient in front of us, what caused this patient to be here? Why is this person here? And the answer is almost always, something bad. Whether it's just even something like an earthquake or a flood. It seems like these are innocent victims. No, they're not innocent victims. What they are marginalized populations living on floodplains that they know flood, but they don't have any choice. It's not quite like buying a resort house in Cornwall. These people are forced into areas that are dangerous, and that's why you end up coming. It's not random when even a natural disaster occurs, who is affected most and who needs medical emergency aid. Another big thing that we've been into is essentially a campaign, and you could call it just, we've become the thorn in the side of big pharma, big pharmaceutical companies. And it really is that generic drugs need to be developed because the places where we work, the people can't afford the brand names, the governments can't afford, the ministries of health can't afford it, we frankly can't afford it, and so pushing on that. And then secondly, if you have male pattern baldness, erectile dysfunction, or you're overweight, there are a large number of billion-dollar, $10 billion, $15 billion a year organizations working for you. If you have Chagas, and I'm glad for that, 2 out of 3, I won't say which ones. Oh man. Okay. And then, but if you've got Chagas, leishmaniasis, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, not so many people are working for you. And pushing things like new drugs that work, pushing diagnostic tools that work. I mean, one of the biggest changes I've seen over my 15 years here was simply the a rapid test for malaria. You didn't have to do a blood test for it. You just prick somebody and put it in, 10 minutes later, you know whether they have malaria or not. It changed everything from having these labs go out and people have to come back the day later. So that's the kind of stuff we've been pushing for. So what is humanitarian action for us, though? Because a lot of people think, humanitarian, it is a crowded field. There's lots of people. This is just the Western side of it. People that are wearing the humanitarian hat. And the word gets thrown around. I mean, humanitarian intervention, humanitarian war. That was NATO's idea of going to war in Bosnia. The justification for the Western intervention in Libya. Humanitarian war, which we see as kind of an oxymoron. The two ideas shouldn't go together. The Federation is a humanitarian armada. Anyone recognize that? What it might come from? Star Trek, yes, somebody. Yeah, the latest Star Trek. I'm trying to get away from work, and then this is what they say in the middle of the movie. Preposterous. If you've got proton torpedoes that can destroy a planet, you're not a humanitarian. You can quote me on that. There's a lot of things that get thrown into the humanitarian hat, and this is an issue for us. I mean, think of a place like Zimbabwe. I mean, I am all for peace building and democracy building, development, all of those things, empowerment. But if you're in a place like Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe is the president, he doesn't want those things. And after a while, there is a perception that that's what NGOs do. That NGOs are in opposition to government and trying to topple us and trying to build and empower the people to overthrow us. And then they don't want an NGO there that's doing essentially humanitarian work. For instance, in that country, a lot of HIV work. So for us, there's quite a lot of things that people put under this hat of humanitarian, but we look at it as having a much more specific definition that comes out of the Geneva Conventions, which are international humanitarian law. And it's there's not animal humanitarianism. I mean, it's kind of a bit to this side. I mean, look, the word human is in the middle of it. Although I did feel bad for Marius the giraffe in Denmark, and really, if that zoo director doesn't go down, doing good for people, helping people with problems, these are too generic. Even for us, relief and development aid, it's a different thing, and the reason is that it's done on a different time scale. What we would say for humanitarian assistance is populations in crisis. Again, that's where that's where you can save lives and alleviate suffering in the greatest numbers. But the other thing about populations in crisis is that you have to act immediately. We are not there to build the system. We are the firemen that keep people alive until the system's built. We're not there to end the war, but somebody, you have to keep people alive. You have to be able to, and it's just, there is a different set of, if you're trying to build, a healthcare system, it is a different approach. That saying, it's better to teach somebody to fish rather than giving them a fish. We give people fish. That's our job. It's other people's job to teach them to fish, but the reason is they know how to fish. They can't get to the river because they're being shot at. That's just a maybe overstretch that proverb. So that's what we do. We are substitution. We don't try and necessarily build up the local infrastructure because what we want to do is save lives in the here and now, and often that we act very, very directly that way. So this is what we think it should look like. This is probably what it looks like because it is very, very tangled up. The use of humanitarian aid, and I'll touch on it only a little bit because it's a whole lecture in itself, by the Western governments as an instrument of war and politics in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia is literally killing us. It places a target on our back by making the building of a healthcare center and the delivery of healthcare are transformed into military objectives of a Western government that is a belligerent actor in a context, let's say Afghanistan. Well, what does that mean? What will the Taliban think if building healthcare centers is part of the military hearts and minds strategy or the building the legitimacy of the Karzai government strategy of your enemy? It doesn't help being a humanitarian actor in that kind of a political dynamic because we don't have armored cars and we don't have guns. So where do we work? Well, resource poor settings where there are high levels of unmet need. It's just unhealthy. I mean, you know, these are areas of the world where there is a very, very high disease burden, and where often there's a lot of insecurity. So transfer, and where do you, if you want to put all those together, where do you end up? One of the places you end up is in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Look, these stats might be a little bit small to see, but you know, about 70 million. And the more important statistics, I think, are maybe, why is MS up there? Let me just get all these out. But you can just see, you know, access to modern healthcare, less than a quarter of the population. IDPs, internally displaced persons, 2.4 million. And in the areas where we work, a much higher percentage than that. And then you can see some of the mortality rates, you know, deaths from malaria, 200,000 people from a preventable disease like malaria. Constant cholera, measles, Ebola, polio, you know, everything is there. And, you know, in North Kivu province alone, this province alone where I visited in August, South Kivu and North Kivu, I mean, you know, roughly 80 militia groups of various, you know, denominations, some of them fairly large armies and some of them very, very small, one warlord with a bunch of really quite violent, abusive, and predatory people, constantly shifting around. And when you put all of that together, you know, for instance, in North Kivu, 6 million people, about 1 million displaced. And then, you know, it's quite a high percentage of the population. Or, think of another way to look at it is, from March 2012 to March 2013, that number went from 500,000 to 1 million. Think about what it takes in a war zone to, you know, and in terrain that looks like this, to deal with another 500,000 people who have left their homes, left their fields, left the water sources that they know are clean, and are, you know, out in the bush or wherever, where what you have are very high levels of things like malaria and cholera and measles. Somewhere there's a road, because I drove on it. It's very difficult. I'm sorry, that slide's not showing us so well, but this is the border between Rwanda and DRC. It's really in this area just 20 years ago, almost, well, in April would be to today, where you had these mass outflux of the Hutu population from Rwanda into Congo. Another picture, you know, and you can see why it's impossible to, you know, to control the territory. You know, a band of militia group just, you know, they can take off and disappear into the forest. This is what a vaccination campaign looks like. This was a measles vaccination campaign. Another part of that campaign. And another. So, you know, just the logistics. And remember, you know, you've got to keep vaccines cold. Did anyone see the electrical poles? No. You know, all of this, I'm just trying to get a sense of, we deal with very, very difficult conditions just from the environment itself, the context itself, and forget about the insecurity. You know, this is one of our hospitals there for HIV/AIDS, and often co-infection with tuberculosis. So here's a young man with tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS, a very, very difficult set of diseases to have at the same time. It's an IDP camp. This is near Goma. Remember I said there are about 1 million IDPs in North Kivu. What's also another, you know, a sad number in there is 14% of that, so 140,000 are in organized camps like this, and almost all the aid goes to these places. Another 15 or 16% are in spontaneous settlements. And then what's that leave? It leaves about 70% who either get by in the bush, go move in with neighbors, and they're very, very hard to identify, they're very hard to find, and they're very hard to provide services to. The other thing I wanted to show, though, it's very difficult to say out. No. There's a person walking about that high. So these tents, you know, you're talking about, in these structures, families are living. And I have to duck to get in them, and they're about this wide. And you're you know, 5, 6 people in each one. They also often, because of the rain, have cooking fires inside them. And if you're in something about the size of a Boy Scout pup tent, and you light a fire and you cook your dinner, you can imagine just the density of the smoke. I mean, we see it, for instance, a lot of eye disease. Not surprising in a place like that. And burns. some new displacement, so people, coming in and getting registered and things like that. A distribution day in Mueso, one of places like Barack Obama, a hero around the world. Yeah, this is a food distribution day, so people waiting in line for World Food Program to come. This is in our clinic in Kashugo. Maybe just a word on a place like Kashugo. Kashugo is a town, a village, whatever. We have established a clinic there. What does it take to establish a clinic there? Well, all the stuff that I talked about in terms of logistics, which is quite difficult. Kashugo is controlled by essentially a warlord. He controls just that area. He is a government. He taxes the people. If the people don't have a tax, they get the crap beat out of them. And they don't pay the $1 a month. They get the crap beat out of them, and they get held. Sometimes they end up with their head cut off and in the river. This is brutal behavior. It's predatory. I used that word before, but it also makes it very difficult for us. We phone him almost every day to negotiate our access. And this is that very difficult world in which we live, where we have to accept the fact that he lets us there because it's in his interest. We're providing health care to the people that are under his control, and we keep them healthy, and he taxes them and uses them as slaves and everything else. And what does that do in terms of it's very difficult for our doctors and logisticians and everyone else. Where are the limits? When bodies start showing up in the river, do you threaten to pull out if he doesn't stop killing the local population and beheading them? What exactly are the limits there? And those are the kinds of things that, in particular, I used to work on in Amsterdam, and then I still try and help teams think about. Because you also can't, if you just, it'd be very easy to be pure and say, well, Mr. Warlord, if you commit a war crime or any kind of violation here, we're leaving. And that, you'll be there for a day, and then nobody has health care. So we're stuck in these dilemmas all the time, and but the pervasiveness of the fear there was quite high. I was talking to one of our nurses, a national staff Congolese person. I was in the street, and I was just asking, there's a river that runs through here. Where is that? Is that over here? And he said, don't point. And I still hadn't switched into local mode. I said, no, the river. I thought maybe he hadn't understood me. Is it over there? He says, please don't point. They'll think that we're talking, they'll think you're a spy, and then I'm telling you something. And he will have trouble. I thought, boy, you can't even point to a river in the center of town. It's a level of the kind of control and fear that operates in a place like Kashugo. You can see this is a very quick assessment. You can see it's in the red. I know that's in the orange, but it's just an upper arm assessment of malnutrition. So, very quick. It's not in the red, so she's not severely malnourished, but she's moderately malnourished in need of supplemental high protein feeding. That's what the hospital, we built a hospital in Mueso, that's what it looks like. Maternity issues are quite serious because it's a mountainous terrain. You can imagine if you've got a problem with your delivery, third day of labor, how do you get to a clinic? It's 10 kilometers away over a mountain and there's no roads. So quite high maternal mortality. Okay, changing landscape. I do a lot of presentations at universities where no one's over 19, and no one, I actually scream Bob Dylan, actually, it's terrible. And then I usually make some joke about the fact that Bob Dylan actually knows how to play an instrument, because musicians back then didn't turn dials and become famous. Global war on terror. What does it mean? And the number of contexts is increasing, with us or against us. We are supposed to be neutral in the battlefield. Nobody's going to let you drive around if they think you're on the other side. And you might remember Colin Powell's great comment during I think it was early 2003, early part of the Iraq War, of NGOs are such great force multipliers for us. And it's like, thank you. A giant crosshairs right on our back. Globalization, obviously there's a lot of aspects to it, but one is, what happens when oil prices go up? and fuel prices go up. I can tell you one thing that happens is about 4 months later, food prices go up. And then you've got a place like Mogadishu, Port-au-Prince, Nairobi, shortages because people can't afford food in the cities. So, things are much more interconnected now, and we're almost always behind step of realizing just how interconnected these things are. Global warming and climate change, it's an ongoing process. It is affecting, in particular, nutrition, but it's also affecting where mosquitoes live. Disease patterns are changing because of weather change. They say that, soon some of the malaria-bearing mosquitoes will be able to be flying up. Well, not this week, but not here, but in lower parts of Europe, you might have mosquitoes that are, till now are contained at sort of sub-Saharan Africa. Urbanization is just, large numbers of people in urban areas that don't have healthcare systems, and in particular can't, or good healthcare systems, or emergency response systems, for instance, cholera, when you have outbreaks of that. Harare in Zimbabwe is a recent, I think it was about 4 years ago, a very, very large cholera outbreak. Conflicts, there's always been conflicts, but the West is a belligerent in these big chunks of the world, and I've mentioned a few already, but also recognize that, special forces of the United States are in much of those, the Sahel, that band across Africa just below the Sahara, which if you remember back to those top 10, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, Sudan, that's the Sahel. Mali, these are places where we need to be, and where, the West is a belligerent and seen as a belligerent, and then, basically, anyone that looks Western becomes an enemy. States, there have always been strong states and authoritarian states, but look, NGOs, we are no longer the naive group of hippies that we were in the 90s. Organizations like MSF go to the Security Council of the United Nations and initiate a process that results in the Security Council looking and examining what's going on, for instance, and we did this in Sierra Leone, in Angola. I mean, you can imagine a country thinking, wait a second, we have to control these people. They're here, they're always writing reports about us, they're always broadcasting and talking about us. So what you have are states that are now increasingly controlling our behavior. And it is a very difficult line to draw. Obviously here in the UK, you wouldn't have NGOs from some foreign country simply driving around distributing healthcare without, right? Especially if they looked funny. You can imagine what you'd think if they had very long beards and wore funny hats. So it's understandable that they need to control things, but what does that mean? And part of it in some countries is outright obstruction. But in others, it's simply, a question, for instance, in Ethiopia, where they want to say, just like here, these are the drugs you can use in our country. But we're 2 years ahead of them in terms of testing and approving drugs that work better. So you have a doctor who says, I'm not using this drug. It is unethical. The better drug's over there. But how do you bring it in? So we spend a lot of time arguing these things with country and maybe even smuggling it in. No, I didn't say that officially, but yeah. This is what we're confronted with. Morbidities are changing, and in particular, there was an interesting article just about a week ago, some research coming out of WHO. Cancer will be up 70% by 2034, and a large burden of this is going to be in low and middle income countries. We see it already. Diabetes, cancer, hypertension. This is what people have in the world. It's no longer just malaria, and we're going to have to increasingly deal with that. But it presents real trouble for what we are used to are infectious diseases. Treat somebody and they go home. Hypertension doesn't work that way. It's also what we're seeing in places like Syria. People don't come in and say, I've got malaria, cure it. They come in and say, I've been seeing a doctor for my heart problems or my diabetes, and now my pharmacy's been destroyed. And so we're being forced to change what we deal with. The Western powers are no longer, they no longer tell everybody what to do, or they keep telling people what to do, but people don't listen so much anymore. So we were thrown out of Sudan, even though the Western nations really, really put a lot of pressure on it not to happen. We were thrown out of the northern area of Sri Lanka, even though the Western nations put a lot of pressure on it not to happen. Sovereignty Sovereignty is a concept that is getting strengthened. And the idea of sans frontières is that actually, when it comes down to choosing between this person being able to receive assistance and you enforcing your sovereignty, we choose people. And that creates a bit of an issue for sovereign states. Immediacy, pretty obvious. Things move quickly and they move around the world. People in caves, insurgents in caves in Pakistan, watch what we are doing in the media in Canada. They study our response in, for instance, in Palestine territories and want to know why we aren't talking more about, for instance, what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing. And that gets back to, they draw political conclusions from that. So it really is a much more interconnected world, and information moves very, very quickly. I'll skip that one. It takes too long. The health world's changing. The Gates Foundation, big pharmaceuticals, the Global Fund. It used to be the World Health Organization, but now there are quite some players out there, really, especially on the philanthropic side, trying to change the nature of healthcare and aid in the world. And for good, but also it makes it at different places. It affects the playing field in which we're in. In particular, for instance, some of the work by Gates and his foundation. Criminalization of actors. Basically, the United States, Britain, some of the other countries have a law that prohibits you from having any sort of association with a terrorist actor. And it sort of makes sense. We're not in the terrorist business. But remember what I said. We have to call people. We negotiate our access with terrorists. We do it fairly regularly. We have to have their phone numbers in our role, in our telephone. That's a crime in some places. Delivering food, that any of our food, that any of our medical care might end up in the hands of a terrorist organization. In the places where we work, it is impossible to believe that there is not leakage. We do a very good job of making sure our aid gets to the people who need it. But the people, these predators out there, they aren't there because they're bad at their job. They are very good at making sure that they get something. And and it gets stolen and other things. So what can we do? We are technically in violation of some of these laws. And that's a real challenge. And it showed in the Somali famine about 2 years ago. Some of the aid agencies privately said, we aren't distributing food up there anymore because we're worried about the potential that it will have it will involve us, it will make us subject to potential prosecution. And so the famine actually gets fueled in areas of the country controlled by terrorists, or the Al-Shabaab group, which is designated as a terrorist. And what do you do about that? So we're another gate in front of our access to people. Commercialization of aid. Aid is a big business. We are in a big business, and there are businesses that are now interested in it, and it's going to change the face of aid over the next 10 years. The for-profit aid sector is growing quite large, and the corporations that simply want to be associated with aid is growing quite large. Technology inflation. Look, we're a medical humanitarian organization. Is anyone here medical? How much time and effort do you put into just keeping up with all of the recent developments? Latest drugs, latest equipment. It's considerable, and you can imagine that in itself, for an organization, and then to find suppliers and to make sure that the drug that's new here actually doesn't break down if it's 50 degrees centigrade, and it really is a lot of work just on that, and it absorbs quite some resources in the organization. Kidnap for ransom. Is there a better business model in the world than kidnapping? And yet, I make a joke out of it, but it's horrible. It has forced us to withdraw from places because we can't negotiate with these people. We negotiate with terrorists, warlords, governments, because there's somebody there. The criminals, they don't advertise and say, negotiate with us. They take you, and then they want to negotiate afterwards. And the impact that is having, because we cannot control it, we cannot mitigate it through good security management and negotiated access, is very, very serious. It is happening now in northern Nigeria, Somalia, a number of places, and it's going to spread. And I don't know what that, no one knows what that means or how to stop it, but it will spread across the Sahel through a lot of countries. We, in MSF, we withdrew from northern Nigeria recently because of the threat of kidnapping. And it forces us to think about some really, the kind of things you don't want to think about. For instance, using white expats is more risky than using black expats. And do you really want to start basing decisions on considerations like that? I don't. Aid doesn't work. You've all heard it. That's another slide show in itself. But it is there is donor fatigue. There's aid doesn't work. I mean, there's a changing world out there in terms of the moral luster of humanitarian action. It didn't solve the world's problems. It was never designed to, but people were expecting something to happen. And actually the problems keep going on, and you could argue that they're getting worse and worse. It's an issue that we have to deal with. Sham aid, transparency, I won't talk about that too much, but really, the pressure for aid organizations to prove that they're doing something has led to, stories that come out of actually you build a school building, which doesn't take much, you rent children to come and sit in it on the day that the people come from headquarters to see it, and that's that. And there is aid that looks like that, and it is the nature and the business-like way in which aid is becoming a set of partnerships where the government gives money to a Western organization that gives money to an intermediate organization that then contracts a fourth organization to build a school, and this is what you end up with. I think a really interesting fact is, delivering humanitarian assistance is kind of a sign that you've arrived as a country. China, Turkey, Kuwait, Brazil are all getting into the business, and I think that's great, as are NGOs in those places. The Turkish Red Crescent was incredibly active in response to the Somali famine, and it's going to challenge us. But for instance, the Chinese organizations do not do témoignage. They do not go into a country, and at first they don't break sovereignty, and they don't start reporting on the human rights violations, as you might imagine. And that's not a bad model if you're one of those countries thinking, do I want MSF there, a bunch of big mouths like that Marc guy, or do we want this Chinese organization that's going to deliver food aid and be quiet about it? Loss of sovereignty. I think this is the last one, and then we can open up the Q&A. Loss of sovereignty over narrative. This is just something I find very interesting. Do you remember Coney 2012? Did people pick up on that video that went viral from the, what do they call it, invisible children in the United States, about capturing Joseph Coney, the brutal war criminal leader of the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda during a certain period of time. And what happened that I found very, very interesting is that in the Western media, this went viral. It told a story. And in the Western media, Ugandans came into the Guardian, into the BBC website, and said, that story is bullshit. Joseph Coney left Uganda 5 years ago. You forgot to mention that in your video. And it's not a small point, because our fundraising, this is a sort of get up on my soapbox, our fundraising, the belief, the model of the Western NGO is of the white savior and the pathetic nation that can't deal with anything or do anything. And that narrative is full of holes. If you think of Darfur, there was the Save Darfur, Save Darfur. That's what you heard about how NGOs saved Darfur. NGOs didn't arrive in Darfur till 6 to 8 months into the crisis. People saved themselves. People, you saw it in the Philippines. You see it in places. That narrative that we are very dependent on is going to be chipped away by people who said, that's not what's happening. And we want you Western NGOs, to stop being the only narrative that people in all of England, all of France, all of Holland, that's the narrative people have for Africa, for Central African Republic, for South Sudan. There's no other narrative out there except for what we talk about, or National Geographic looking at, either animals or, very, very primitive behavior. And that narrative is being chipped away, and we don't control it anymore. And the last thing I'll say about that is Myanmar. Western Myanmar is a place where the Rakhine State is where the Rohingya population live. They're Muslim. rest of Myanmar is Buddhist. They are considered stateless. They are considered an enemy. They are persecuted and oppressed to a great, great extent. And lately, they've been burned out. There's quite some, I would call them pogroms, ethnic cleansing, whatever. There are other people using the word genocide. We've been serving that population for years. Why? Because they are the most in need. They don't have access to health care. Makes sense. We don't control the Facebook and Twitter feeds of the militant Buddhists who are now saying MSF is pro-Muslim, who are saying, we know where MSF, we know where your staff lives. We know what time they leave work and go home. And we can't control that. And it's over and over again, MSF is pro-Rohingya, MSF is pro-Muslim. And you can put out all the stuff you want. No, we're not. We're neutral, impartial, and independent. It doesn't matter. And that, we no longer control what basically people think about us. And that, that is, it's going to be a good thing when you have people in a camp somewhere tweeting, hey, that aid organization, they never have any food over there, or they never have the medicines that they say they have. That's good. That's empowerment. But it's also going to be situations like Myanmar. And then in terms of, I just listed out all those trends. This is a friend of mine over at ODI here, Overseas Development Institute. Basically, everything seems unprecedented. If you go back 20 years ago, people were talking about it. It's like MSF just discovered urbanization, which I remember reading about like when I was at Yale. So, it matters because we need access to people. And most of those factors I talked about really are changing the dynamics of access. And look, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Nigeria, we don't have the access that is warranted by the needs on the ground. We can't get in. We're overly controlled by government, or it's too violent. We pulled out of Somalia this year. I'm sorry, 2013. We took the decision. We had done, actually, you can see it there. In 2012, we did 624,000 outpatient consultations in Somalia. That's a lot of outpatient work in Somalia, and we will do 0 in 2014. And that is in a place where we're doing that many because there are no other options for the people. And part of the reason why we pulled out, there were a lot of reasons, but we had 2 expats, 2 Spanish women abducted and free after 21 months. Yeah, 21 months in captivity. This is these are ominous trends. And just, you've seen it in the news, just a few quick photos if you want to ask about. But right now, Central African Republic is really melting down. And it looks as if, there's some real chance that the entire Muslim population of Central African Republic will essentially be chased out of the country. And this is just, makeshift situations. It's really, really quite a bad situation. And this is happening as we speak. And then in South Sudan, that was also in the newspaper a lot, where you had all of a sudden a flood, 2 political bigwigs arguing, and then the ethnic groups that follow them, the Nuer and the Dinka, really involved in quite some violence. And so again, MSF had to clear out of a healthcare center in a place called Lair, evacuate the entire international team, and just leaving behind patients in the hospital. But there's just nothing else you can do when the threat of violence is so high. Okay, so I'm sorry that took long. I've eaten into your Q&A time, although as director I can of the building. We don't have to leave at 8. We can leave whenever. But I want to just sort of throw a lot out there, and I apologize for throwing a lot out there. But hopefully it sparks some questions that you guys want to talk about. We can look a little bit more in depth on things.
Can I ask about for-profit aid and
Yes.
also the Gates Foundation?
Sure. I'm probably better on the former, but go ahead.
Well, I'd like to know more about for-profit aid and what's going on with that. And then also you're saying the Gates Foundation is changing the face of aid in certain ways.
I mean, first, when I talk about aid there, it's probably more the big picture of aid, meaning development aid, relief aid, and things like that. And you have, it is something that they're trying to encourage, this government here in the UK, because it's been such a success in the United States. The Beltway, you look at organizations like Development Alternatives Inc., Chemonics, These are very large, they're businesses, and they basically say to a government, that says, you want to distribute, you want to build 50 schools, you want to build 50 health centers, you want to distribute food, we can do it. We can do it better than the NGOs. We probably won't write any bad reports about you guys, and we are more effective, more efficient, and we can do that job. And in many of the places where you see very, very large contracts, for instance, Afghanistan, Pakistan, those for-profit aid have been getting those contracts. I don't necessarily, I think that a lot of NGOs need a bit of a shake-up around their effectiveness and their efficiencies and things like that. And I think that the competition there is good. But let's remember, you don't get, if you're for-profit, you are not in Central African Republic. You're not basing your decisions on the need of people. It's not humanitarian. It's paid for aid and relief aid. And there's a real difference of what that means in terms of people's access to assistance when they need it. Because the for-profit sector isn't going to the places unless there's a political interest that generates the kind of funding and contracts to send you there. The other part of it is probably just that there's a lot of aid now. I think some of the new models for development are some of them are very interesting around social entrepreneurship, development, really looking at that sector a little bit differently than just the old, NGO out there trying to build people from a grassroots basis. And, big corporations being asked to use investment in a way that actually is tied in with aid. So, there's a lot of different facets to it. I was at something recently where Justin Greening, the minister for head of DFID here in UK, she was basically talking to a lot of corporate heads, and what they're saying is, we want your governmental agency to create stability, because that's development, and maybe it is. It's hard to argue against stability, but basically what they're saying is, we want a better business environment so we can go in these places. And there is an intersection there, and it's hard to deny it. But there's also something a little bit worrisome for somebody like me who says, yeah, but what if the driver of it is that? Where will it go, and what countries will it benefit, and things like that. And then you have China, for instance, really, really deeply, heavily investing in Africa, and hand in hand with its aid. And using aid in quite a different way. So that's, I would say that's commercialization of aid is something that's coming. And I think a lot of these companies will be saying, we can do their job and we can do it better. And it is, in particular, in some of these war zones. You asked about Gates. I don't follow that brief. By and large, they're doing quite a lot of investment in malaria and HIV, and I think all of those things are quite laudable. They are also very involved in changing policy and controlling their partners. They are looking to have impact and influence, and that's something that concerns us at times, because it's not always that we line up in terms of how to approach certain things. And we do. There are places where we use Gates-funded antiretrovirals, because we can't actually. Myanmar is a place, for instance, where we have a fairly large contract, or the government has the contract, but we're running all the centers, and you worry about what does it mean in that way. What are their priorities, and how do they set their priorities? And that's probably it.
First, this is really extraordinary work. I'm just completely impressed here and starstruck. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is, it seems to me that for your operation, you have a lot of data that could help with whether medical research, even a lot of intelligence data, imagine. What do you do with this sort of information? And then the follow-up question to that is, it seems to me that the business model or the delivery mode hasn't evolved since the setup days. So where do you see this evolving?
The first question is the easier question. MSF in particular, and this office of MSF, really organizes quite a bit of research. We don't do it necessarily for the sake of research, but we do it for the sake of improving our own performance and what we're able to do. So we run drug trials. We are very involved here in trying, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis right now takes 20 months of a cocktail of pills that makes you vomit, lose your hearing. It's horrible. And all these side effects, and we want something that is more effective, much more rapid, and we're pushing those kinds of things. So we actually run some trials, but also things, simplification. How do you just, what do you do in resource poor settings where you can't have a doctor for everything? So we do real research, you might say, around things where it's, it's scientifically valid. We publish quite a bit. We have a scientific day that's organized by this office where we talk about it. There's information on the website. It is, we on some of these diseases, sleeping sickness and leishmaniasis, we're front runners in terms of the research. Data is a different issue. It is one that we are, I think, moving towards. There are a number of people in the organization that basically say, look, first we had to get control of our own data, and that's very hard to do. But we have pretty sophisticated health information data systems, and we have a fraction of the resources necessary to really be able to use that data. And we have, on certain specific things, let outsiders, university, a partnership with London School or Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, look at stuff and really, mine it. And I think we're moving in the direction of, open source on some things and really trying. But of course, it's linked into, there's patient health information. I mean, we have to make sure we do that in the right way, and we don't necessarily have the resources for it. But that's where it's going, because you're absolutely right. And we, in this office, we have a couple of people loaned to us, you might say. I think it's from one of the universities and it's from London School who come and help us just with our data. We've got 3 epidemiologists who work out of this office, and that's their work. So that's all happening. The operational model, MSF is a dinosaur. We're thought of as a dinosaur. We don't work through local partners the way others do. We still put international people on the ground. We look very similar, and there are people who say you need to change, and there are other people who say actually it's pretty effective, and we don't see that the others have another model that's more effective. So the basic model is still there, and it is. We will be forced to change as diseases change. We are forced to change in Syria right now, where we can't get inside. It changes, but by and large, it is still trying to get doctors and nurses and nutritionists and others next to, à côté des malades. That was one of the early phrases, next to people who are sick and in need of it. And that, that's basically, get a bunch of stuff and, make sure it's safe and get them in. And that doesn't change so much. But we, I spend a lot of time, that's the kind of stuff I like to get into, what is the safer model and the better model and the more agile model. We're not particularly agile anymore. But
is that a function of the size of the organization?
Probably, yeah. And the sophistication of what we're trying to do now. I mean, we're doing multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in war zones. I mean, in the old days it was diarrhea and malaria. We have the data. We monitor our fatality rates. We have targets. It's, aid is no longer a naive business. Okay, actually, we'll go with the guess.
Yeah.
Why don't we start?
Oh, okay.
Sorry to
I was just curious what your thoughts are on the drug industry's involvement in investing in infrastructure and that. I just went to Novartis's headquarters and all the hack days and what they're doing. And a lot of these drug companies are investing a lot, obviously with the business interest because they see this emerging market.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just curious how you view their involvement.
I think there's a lot of good people working in good organizations and good companies, and corporate social responsibility has a role. But when you say it, what is that role, and what is the driver of that action? I would say because it's in the interest of that business. That's what they have a fiduciary responsibility to do things that are in the interest of that business. Novartis in particular has fought MSF on a number of fronts and fought very, very hard to keep generic drugs out of, for instance, in South Africa, there's a very big case of Novartis, I think in India as well. They are not at the top of the list of good guy pharmaceutical. At the same time, look, who makes, there's certain things, I'm pretty sure it's the meningitis vaccination, there's only one pharmaceutical company that makes it these days, and we have to use the World Health Organization to negotiate with them to make sure that there's enough of a supply. But look, my personal opinion, not my MSF opinion, my personal opinion is I think if the pharmaceutical companies really want to do something, they should stop pushing, fighting against the generics. And in places in Africa, with the amount of budget that health, that ministries of health have, they need access to drugs they can afford.
Can I just make a comment about that?
Sure.
It's interesting how you're doing quite a bit of work with WHO, and there's a thing called proprietary essential medicines list, and they've been very much at creating formulations of drugs for children, because really there's only about 5 diseases that are killing children in the developing world. And one of the fundamental issues is that if in the West you have a bottle of medicine which you put in the fridge and you give it to your child in insulin, etc. But if you haven't got a fridge, you need to have dissolvable formulations. And a lot of these drugs need to be in combinations, put together in one tablet, and they have to be dissolvable. And no big pharma company is going to invest in creating formulations. And it's huge. It's quite an easily solvable problem, and something that you could radically change the reduce mortality in many parts of Africa and the developing world by doing this, and yet it can't be done. It's a huge problem. They're trying to convince the Indian generic manufacturers to produce them instead. But it's just, I think, a reflection of it's the simple things that actually sometimes but sometimes it's very difficult to achieve.
Yeah. No, and MSF, and I think there are other organizations working. Okay, if the profit motive doesn't necessarily drive that, can you influence that by offering taxes or prizes for developing things that you wouldn't necessarily develop just out of a sort of a Western market approach. Another question for
I just had a question about are you finding it increasingly difficult to recruit doctors to work in the field, especially in the face of these challenges?
No, actually, I think the other challenges come from actually keeping doctors. Because look, if you're a doctor and you're qualified here and you go away with MSF for 4 years and you come back, you've slid, you might have lost your license or registration or some of these things, or so it's quite difficult sometimes from that perspective, and to keep people to the point where they are, we need the experienced people who have really seen a lot before, rather than always just the first missioners. That's one thing. We also need first missioners because they become experienced. The other thing is, we're dealing with ever more complex diseases, and we're working in places in Syria. With all due respect, they don't want to see a 28-year-old doctor. They've got marvelously experienced doctors there, and you can't send in. They will just say this person doesn't have enough experience to work on our people here. So we deal with some of those issues, but it is harder to get. If you then need people with greater experience, you're talking about people who have families, who have practices, who have lives, and can't go off for a year to Congo as easily. So we struggle with those issues, but one of the things that we've done quite a good job about in MSF is we're no longer dependent on the Western doctor. We've got Pakistani doctors and Congolese doctors and Argentinian doctors. They're really, really staffing our programs all around the world, and that We always need good doctors, don't get me wrong, we always need it, but it's not one of our key challenges. The key challenges is actually getting doctors who will stay with us for 10 years and run a medical department.
What you mentioned about having to withdraw from Somalia last year,
Yes.
This may be completely uninformed of me, but I was wondering if that had ever happened to MSF before, to withdraw completely from a country, and when that does happen, how can one later assess whether it's safe to go back?
Yeah, I'll take the second one first. I mean, we've got a team that's in Nairobi still, that is in negotiation and maintains the contact lines. You don't want to lose all those phone numbers and all those people that we used to have contacts with. Stays in touch with our Somali staff inside to try and stay on top of the situation. It's almost a small team down there just doing that. But it is very hard in many places, and it's something we learned the hard way in a couple of places, especially where there's high administrative hurdles. Just to get yourself registered again can take a whole year in some countries. Do you really want to completely withdraw? And one of the advantages MSF has had over the years, remember I mentioned in the very beginning we have 5 big operational centers. Sometimes not all of them will withdraw in response to something going on. So, you know, we have had that, you know, if 2 or 3 of the operational centers withdraw, but other ones stay behind. So it's not, you make your political point, but at the same time, you keep some people behind. Have we done it before? We've been kicked out of, you know, for instance, out of northern Sri Lanka. We were kicked out of Ethiopia in 1984. There have been places we withdrew from the camps that I talked about 20 years ago in eastern Zaire at the time, the camps of the Hutu populations from Rwanda, where we started to realize that the aid system was being used to siphon off large amounts of aid to the genocidaires, the actual militant, extremists who had been part of the genocide in Rwanda, and we withdrew voluntarily from all of those there's different reasons in all of those. I think Somalia is the first place that I can think of where we were forced to take that decision. You know, just collectively unable to ensure our own security. And it's never perfect, your security, but there, what we saw is the level, the officials, whether that's government officials, local leaders, elders, or people, the people we were negotiating with, the Al-Shabaab and militia groups, tolerating and condoning violence against us, and if not perpetrating it. And yeah, you can't work in that kind of environment if people aren't going to, if it's that highly tolerated. We had a number, we had three people murdered there in January 2008. We had 2 people murdered there in December 2011. We had the kidnaps. And what we saw there, for instance, the murder of the 2 people in 2011 is well known to the authorities. Spent a month in jail and was then released. And what does it mean when people see that, oh, you killed two MSF aid workers and you're free on the streets after a month? So those are the kinds of factors that went into that decision.
You said very early on that you were not teaching them how to fish, but you were just giving them fish. So immediate aid. What do you do when the sort of patient on your table is the next day going to pick up a gun and put 5 more patients on your table?
Yeah. Some people would say that that's our business model. Quite a cynical view of aid. First, look, I made that point about teaching. Of course, though, of course, we do lots and lots and lots and lots of training. Of that 34,000 staff worldwide, there's only 3,000 that are internationals. We use doctors and nurses, and we train them up to our protocols and our standards. But that isn't the objective. The project purpose doesn't say go and train people so that one day later they will have better health care in that country. That's a job for another type of NGO. What we say is we need all these people to understand how to treat cholera to this level of quality, and so we do quite a bit of training. So so it's not quite so simple. But we don't, we aren't there to build systems. But what we do also is we pioneer ways of, for instance, dealing with HIV/AIDS in a resource-poor setting that work and that governments can then use. But the purpose of it was to get care to our patients, not to help the government out, you might say. And, oh God, I'm blanking on the second question.
It's all combined into one. I mean, do the people on the ground make the decision to ever refuse care?
Yeah, no, but you also had that difficult question. The answer is no, The Geneva Conventions and medical ethics are pretty clear. Once you put down your weapon, you are no longer a combatant. You are basically a non-combatant. And if you're wounded or sick, you have a right under the Geneva Conventions to receive assistance. And that's basically the way we address things. And what that means, though, what's much more difficult is not that they might pick up a gun and the moral dilemma of what might happen. I don't think that's what goes through. I think medical ethics deals with that. You're not really allowed to, just let somebody die because you think they might be the next Hitler. What is more difficult is what's the population going to think? And I was in Darfur, and I used to really lecture people about how we were independent, about impartial, about medical ethics, and all that exact point. And then I would always get, and everyone would go, yeah, we understand. And I said, okay, let's pretend right now the Janjaweed, you remember the Janjaweed, ride in here, rape a bunch of people, shoot some of your people, and as they're riding out, someone throws a brick, knocks him off his horse, and he's there. And you've got 10, 15 people wounded yourself, but the most sick person, the one most in need of immediate assistance, is that Janjaweed guy. We're going to treat him. And they all say, no, you can't do that. They're the enemy. They did this to us. And it's very difficult because if the word goes out in the camp, you're treating one of them. It is very hard to control those sorts of situations. We have closed a project just north of Kashugo because the population said, and it's not true, but the word went out that we were kind of helping out the local warlord up there who, had was aligned with one ethnic group, and the other ethnic group decided that MSF was no longer partial. A little bit the same thing. Do you deny aid to a Rohingya in western Myanmar because it might get you in trouble with the Buddhist militia groups? And the answer is no. You fight and work on it, but that has a cost sometimes. And that's the kind of dilemmas we face. Is not everybody reads the Geneva Conventions, or if they do read them, they don't necessarily respect them. Should I take one more question, or I'm sorry, maybe two?
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, I was just curious. Who is your typical donor? And
You are.
no, I was wondering if
I'm
there's
serious.
any government
no,
or because I imagine you need the room for and flexibility to be free to do whatever.
Which is why we are largely, and probably more than any other organization in the humanitarian field, with the exception of World Vision, they get quite a bit of money from the church. We are 89%, I think, in 2012. 2013 will be about the same, but 89% private funded, and that is lots and lots of little people signing up and giving 20 pounds, $20, 20 marks, whatever, a month, those kinds of things, and that is what we're based on. That's over 50% of our income here. I'm sorry, it was 30% last year because we got a very nice, what a terrible word, a legacy, but somebody died and left us a lot of money. So, but usually it's around 50% of our income here is just little donations, and they mount up. And that is because in Pakistan, when you negotiate with the Taliban, they ask you, where'd you get your money from? And if you say, oh, the U.S. government gave it to us, what do you think? Oh, fine, the U.S. government, great. They're only, institutional funding from governments follows political interests. And that's the first thing. So where you can get it is where it taints you. You don't want it. And of course you can get some from Malawi, and we do, and places like that. But the second thing is, we are an emergency organization. When cholera breaks out, there's two types of organizations. Organizations that go and set up a camp and a cholera treatment center, and organizations start filling out forms. You have to be the first one if you're going to save lives and alleviate suffering. You need financial independence. And lastly, it really is, quite in places like Central African Republic, there is no funding in a place like that before. Now there is a little bit, but if you wanted to work where people are most in need, you need to be able to go where that funding wasn't available. So that's our typical donor. In the UK, we are not the big NGOs that Oxfam and Save the Children British Red Cross are, but we have a very loyal, broad donor base, and that's the donor magazine that dispatches. You take one; it's very easy to sign up over the web. We need, this money. I've said it before. Income for us isn't just every NGO needs income, right? But if we don't have private income, we can't be humanitarian. We can't work where people are most in need, and we can't respond to crisis immediately. And that's what we see with a lot of other actors that do not have our financial independence. They are not able to scale up when there's an earthquake in Haiti, or actually, there you're able to scale up because it's in the media. What you're not able to do is scale up in South Sudan when 100,000 people come across the border, or in Central African Republic, and that's what you need the money for the places where people won't give you, where you can't do the media advertising.
You mentioned something.
Last question, so there's pressure on you.
Oh.
It has to really.
Well, this is an outgrowth of that question, also of something you said earlier, where you had to be very careful about how you communicated with people, because other people might be watching and think that you were a spy.
Yeah.
And my question was, how much do you feel that the intelligence services worldwide have actually truly infiltrated NGOs and similar organizations?
Yeah, I blogged on it. Actually, Humanitarian is my blog site where I blog, and I blogged twice on that because I think it's a growing issue. What happened in Pakistan when the CIA used the cover of a measles vaccination campaign or polio, no, it was measles, to identify essentially Osama bin Laden. That doesn't help us. The Al-Shabaab, the Al-Shabaab are the jihadis that were in control of Somalia, and they didn't want Westerners in there. And people are going, what are you, crazy? You don't want them distributing food to your people. Well, it's not so crazy to think that Westerners weren't there with the best interests of Al-Shabaab. And it's impossible to know. I think what's safe to say is that they've put people in our organizations, right? It would be stupid of them not to. And what I've said is actually we should actually start pushing. At what point should we NGOs stand up and say, let's make a law in the UK that makes that illegal? And will that stop the behavior? I don't know, but it's a bit more plausible in terms of arguing back. I think the more worrisome, the second time I blogged, was the more worrisome revelations that came out of, for instance, the NSA and Snowden's revelations that they are using all kinds of information. And a colleague at the Humanitarian Dialogue Center in Geneva was saying, he goes to places and he has to negotiate with people, and it's about creating dialogue. And right now, aid groups are saying, leave all phones. It's not even turn them off. It's all phones turned off and outside the room. And they are, and when I said before about how in the cell phone of our project coordinator, Moiso, he has a number of every militia group up there. And the Somali project coordinators and heads of mission had the phone numbers of Al-Shabaab. What does that mean? It's in your phone. And people can get at it, it seems. So it's a concern, and it has to, I need a fourth slide. Because the perception, I'll leave it at this. I think all of you probably at some time or other visited a doctor, and you of course want technical competence, but even more than that, you want to believe, and you have to believe that you have to trust your doctor. You have to trust that your doctor is there to deliver care to you with no ulterior objective in mind. And when you lose that trust, when people believe that you're not there for that purpose, or suspect, it breaks down that fundamental doctor-patient relationship. And we are, we don't carry guns, we can't fight our way into giving people aid. And if they don't have that trust that our medical teams are there just to do medical aid and nothing else, once you lose that trust, you lose your access. And that that is the specter, you know, sort of the humanitarian, you know, the ghost of Christmas future for humanitarians. So I'll leave it at that note. Yes, we have a task in front of us to defend our trust. And thank you all.
I think we all feel quite honored to have been able to hear what you have
My
to say today,
It's my
and really moved by the dedication of the people who work in this field. I'd like to thank you all for coming,
Yes.
and if you join me in thanking Marc.
It's a pleasure. And remember, my job does end on February 28th, and I'll be looking for work. I have nothing lined up. I have some travel lined up, but that's my plug. I will be looking.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We had 9 people.
It's working.
That's why I'm just going to turn this off. Thank you.